Excellent. Well, yeah, thank you, everybody. Appreciate you carving out some time in your day to be with us. We have what I think will be a really compelling and hopefully very useful set of training around wildfire risk underwriting and mitigation. I will just first mention and reiterate the Q&A functionality specifically. Like, please use that throughout to the extent I'll be monitoring that. Really, the stars of today's presentation will be Gary and Paul here, but I'll be sort of monitoring the Q&A. We have dedicated some time at the end to address some of those questions. So to the extent that it's a question that makes more sense to answer at the end, that's what we'll do. If it's something smaller that I can address directly, I'll be monitoring that throughout the presentation. Quick background for myself before we get into the agenda. As Maddie mentioned, I'm Brian Bastian. I'm our head of product at Green Shield. My background's in meteorology, and I have the sort of pleasure of working with Paul and Gary on the product side to help craft really solutions to help our clients, better manage and mitigate the risk of wildfire. And so for today's agenda, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about who we are, like why we're here, sort of our background, our experience in this space, and a bit of the why, both the marketplace and risk trends with respect to wildfire. And then we're going to hit pretty hard on what those key learning objectives are. And then we'll be kind of transitioning into really the meat of the presentation. And that will be Paul's piece. And then lastly, we'll wrap up, as I mentioned, with the Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Gary Raphael.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate that. Hi, everybody. As Brian said, my name is Gary Raphael, and I am the head of business development for the Property Guardian program at Green Shield. Before we get into the core elements of today's discussion, I wanted to just take a quick minute and give you a sense for the individual and collective bona fides and experience of the team that's going to be speaking with you today. So in that spirit, a little bit of background on me. I have 30 plus years of risk mitigation experience in the insurance industry. Most of my roles have been client facing, advising high net worth clients and corporate clients on how effectively to prevent loss. And I've worked across the insurance industry spectrum. I've worked for carriers. I was an agent for a while. And I've also worked in the risk management, claims, and loss control spaces. Brian gave you a little bit of a taste for his experience, and I know Paul is going to share some of his background, the details of his background as he walks you through the slides. But I think it's important to call out and to highlight his extensive experience on the front lines of wildfire suppression, literally mapping strategy and executing suppression tactics in the midst of active wildfires across the Western U.S. And his firsthand experience, his firsthand fire service experience, is an invaluable dynamic to our mission. And I know you're really going to enjoy hearing from him as he walks you through the slides. A few highlights about Green Shield itself. So beyond the three of us, Green Shield is founded by a group of highly experienced insurance industry professionals who have confronted many of the same challenges that probably inspired your attendance at today's event. We often like to say that we're a young company, but we're not new at this by any stretch. Our sole focus is wildfire and bringing dynamic mitigation-based solutions to the marketplace. But our plans do include applying our assessment talents to other perils in the months ahead. So we ask you to stay tuned for that. That will be an exciting expansion of what we do. And our Property Guardian program is unique in many ways. Hopefully you'll see that as we spend some time together, but perhaps it's no more so than in our ability to assess structural resiliency at the parcel level and prescribe tailored mitigation guidance to underwriters and property owners. And you'll see those dueling dynamics as Paul walks through his slides. So with all of that as kind of preamble, I'm going to suggest that the three of us come off camera, and we're going to transition just to the slide deck itself. And then we're going to start by briefly discussing some trends that literally inspired the development of Green Shield. So hopefully everyone on the call can agree that we've reached a pretty critical inflection point in the treatment of wildfire, excuse me, and the impact that our collective response could potentially have on the broader economy. I think it's fair to say that wildfire season is now viewed as closer to a year-round issue than a seasonal issue. In fact, there's data that suggests that on average, wildfire season is lasting 2.5 months longer than it has historically. The number of fires, the amount of acres burned, and the dollars lost only continues to grow. And no matter the source, the data all agrees that the threat of wildfire and its impact on U.S. property is touching more and more people and reaching more and more of us. And certainly this slide is intended to underscore that point. I think it illustrates it in stark contrast. It's also touching into more and more states, as you can see by the map and the state outlines. And this trend is only projected to continue to grow. And that growth is illustrated again in these maps. By some estimates, some 4.5 million U.S. properties are now considered to be in high wildfire exposure areas. The next slide transitions that sort of holistic statewide examination into dollar values. And wildfire losses are taking an enormously disruptive toll on property and lives. And as you can see, now reaching nearly $4 billion US in annual property damage. This slide depicts the rapid progression of this toll nationwide over about a 50-year period, a 50-year window. And despite each of those successive windows getting smaller, the numbers are actually increasing. And these figures also underscore the connection between the ever-growing value of property lost and the non-renewal and capacity constraints in place in the market, especially in the state of California. 3 wildfires in the short span of 2 years illustrate the growing devastation of individual events and the disproportionate impact of a single event on underwriting profits. And all of this is trending in the wrong direction. Results are escalated by drought, stronger winds, warmer temps, and lower humidity. On this slide, while California is the focal point for most of us, and understandably so, the earlier slide of the map that I showed you notes and depicts that this issue is just becoming increasingly widespread. California is still the most active, but the trend lines in other states are also worrisome, as this data underscores. More places that traditionally seemed like outliers in this conversation, like, for example, here in the States, Texas and Florida, are becoming the new front lines of the wildfire battle. Now, back to California for a second. So, while California, as I said, this threat continues to evolve beyond the boundaries of California, it is still clearly an acute issue there. Coverage for wildfire has dramatically impacted homeowner insurance affordability and availability. In fact, as this slide clearly suggests, many have concluded that wildfire can't be priced properly and that risk can't be selected with confidence. And so when coverage is offered, rates are only marching toward record highs. In fact, data suggests that commercial and personal premiums have risen by approximately 300% in the years following the fires that I highlighted on the earlier slide. So some property owners decide to self-insure, or others rely on overburdened state-funded plans. But either way, this is creating hardship for property owners and potentially collateral damage into the real estate market. It's interesting to note that since we created this slide a few weeks back, it's actually already dated, disappointingly, as other large carriers have announced plans to restrict their underwriting activity, as I said, in just the past 2 or 3 weeks. I'm sure you've seen some of that news. So the next slide just encapsulates some thoughts on how all of this could potentially change. At Green Shield, we believe there needs to be some acknowledgement that traditional wildfire scores are are waning in their value as it relates to meeting the need and meeting the moment, as it was just depicted on the slide earlier. More impactful data is available than ever before, and needs to be leveraged effectively to find good risks in bad locations. Property owners need to be engaged in this process, and we need to educate them on the critical steps that can improve resiliency. And of course, as suggested by the theme of today's session, we need to continue as an industry to bring creative underwriting solutions to the discussion. Now, clearly, there are state-level legislative dynamics that impact this situation, but that's not within our immediate scope at GreenShield. So more specifically about today's session itself, and then I'll sort of transition things over to Paul. We are not looking to make wildfire scientists out of everybody on the call. Rest easy. But we have identified 4 core learning objectives that we think can help you to better assess wildfire exposure as soon as our session ends, frankly. And so they include giving you a better understanding of the key factors that contribute to wildfire risk, giving you a better sense for effective risk mitigation strategy around wildfire and how to, where possible, control some of that vulnerability and risk and improve resiliency, giving you a better sense for the scientific dynamics of the structure ignition zone and what that means, and then help to identify, most importantly, best practices for underwriting wildfire exposed properties. So with all of that as a backdrop, I'm going to transition things to Paul. But as I do that, we wanted to take a slight pause and ask you to provide a little bit of feedback to the first of several poll questions we'll be asking throughout today's presentation. And this one specifically speaks to your motivation for attending the session today. So we're going to give you 20, 30 seconds to give that some thought, and we'd appreciate a response back. And while you're considering that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Paul.
Thanks, Gary, and nice to meet everybody. My name is Paul Brady. Excuse me. I am the head of Wildfire Insights and Mitigation here at GreenShield, and I'll be taking you through wildfire behavior as well as wildfire mitigation, but really how it affects you at the underwriting desk. So once the poll questions are concluded, we'll get started. Okay. It looks like, and I'll kind of zoom this into the screen so that everybody can see. It looks like the majority of you are here for really all of the above, which is great because we are going to hit all of these categories. And I really think that it's going to be really enlightening as we make our way through this presentation. So first, we're going to go through the fundamentals of wildfire risk, as well as, the fundamentals of wildfire and risk selection. So in order to do risk selection really well, you have to understand, basic and advanced fire behavior, or a little bit of advanced fire behavior, but really at the firefighter level, and that's what we're going to be going through today, in order to make that risk selection. So when you're making that risk selection and someone says, is this a good risk or a bad risk? When you're looking at it, what are you looking at? In order for you to understand what you're looking at, you have to know a little bit about the fire environment. So first, the very basics is really, what does it take to sustain combustion? And that's really, it's oxygen, heat, and fuel. You take any one of these elements away and the fire goes out. Well, there's only one element that we can actually control before a fire happens, and that really is fuel. And that's going to be the highlight of this presentation, is really, how do we manipulate this? How do we make a difference, on our properties, or how do we understand our properties when it comes to fire behavior? How do we understand our properties when it comes to mitigation? And that really starts surrounding fuel. So there's different methods of heat transfer. To understand fire, you have to understand how it transfers to other objects. So first you have radiation. And really radiation, what that is if you go out into the sun, you can feel the sun heating your skin. That's what radiation is. If you're standing around a fire pit, and you're at 5 feet, 2 feet away, and you're getting warm, that's radiation. And then you have convected heat. And that's really the hot gases going up, and you can see this flame, and it says convection going up. And what that really is if you put your hand right over that fireplace, your hand will start to burn. And it's not because your hand's inside the fire, It's because the hot gases that are rising really quickly start to bake your hand. Now, that's what happens when embers get underneath decks of homes. They start baking the bottoms of the boards of your decks. So, getting that vegetation out from underneath the decks is extremely important because that's that convective heat, and that's how it works. It's not just a radiant heat where it's warming the structure, now it's physically cooking the structure. And then you have your conduction, and that's just direct flame impingement, obviously, the worst of all three. That if there is direct flame on the walls of your structure, even if it's small, is quite damaging. And so we're going to talk about how to, one, get the radiation to a way that, if it is near the structure, how is it at a level that would be appropriate? So let's get into a little bit of fire behavior. And so the behavior of fire is different than fire itself. So when understanding fire behavior, it goes into another triangle, which is three categories. And really, how a fire behaves is all three things: the weather, the topography, and the fuels. And once again, the only one that we can control is the fuels, because we're not going to control the weather. And the topography, we're likely not going to control. Really, the one that we can manipulate is the fuels. So, in order to stop combustion, we can manipulate the fuels. In order to manipulate the fire behavior within the area, it is also the fuels. So, what are we talking about when we talk about fire behavior? So, first, we have to understand the elements of fire behavior. And so, this is smoldering. And this was actually one of the lowest intense burns. And we would actually like this within, when we're talking about defensible space. What is good defensible space? What kind of fire is appropriate to be on the ground? This is appropriate to be on the ground as long as it's not impacting any of the structures, as long as it's not near the walls. But having a low intensity burn like this, where it's just smoldering, which is really, barely any flame, just, creeping around, very easy to put out, but also not very intense, not very much radiation heat, not very much convection coming off a fire like this. When you think about creeping fire, that's actually, you have a little bit of flame, still very low intensity, has a little more convective heat, but really not damaging and slowing spread. The spread is extremely slow. So when it comes to a creeping fire, that's a low intensity burn, and that's exactly what you want. That means that it's a low intensity burn, nothing's getting damaged. If you notice, even the trees in this area are not getting damaged. So what are the bad kinds of fire behavior that we really don't want, when it comes to our properties? And it's important that we understand fire behavior, because if we understand what fire behavior does, then we can say, okay, these elements lead up to this type of fire behavior, or these elements lead up to better fire behavior. And so we have running fire. And so a running fire is something that has, and they say, a well-defined head. That's really a well-defined flaming front of where the fire is actually going. You have dark plumes in your higher, more dense vegetation, thicker vegetation, and a light plume, but really it's just a defined area where it's going there very quickly. This is something where there's continuous vegetation within the area, and we'll kind of get into that. So this is not the fire behavior. There can be a lot more radiant heat, a lot more convective heat within the area, which could be extremely damaging to our properties. And then you have crowning. So, vegetation in general, when you're thinking about vegetation, you should think that vegetation could, or fire can ignite about 3 times the height of the vegetation it's burning. So a 100-foot tree can put off a 300-foot flame. Now, the radiant heat from this would be extremely damaging. It's no longer, warming yourself next to a fire. Now it would actually start degrading the walls of our structure, or start igniting the decks. So it's not just the convective heat at this point, it's really the radiant heat. A flame this big is extremely damaging. But a flame this big needs to be able to get into the trees of the canopies, or sorry, the canopy of the trees. And so how do we stop this from happening? How do we not allow this to happen? And then the last one, which is spotting. And so spotting is really when you have a large wildfire, even a smaller wildfire, cast embers onto our properties, they start igniting small spot fires. And that is extremely damaging to our structures, because according to IBHS, 90% of structures get damaged or destroyed by ember fallout. And I agree, being on the front line, it looks like stars in the sky landing on these properties. They start getting, they start falling in between the boards of a deck. They start getting into the attic space. They start getting onto the rugs and start igniting the doors, or they start getting into the bark mulch. And then even though it's a smoldering fire, it's now getting that conduction because it's at the base of the wall, starting to bake the base of the wall. So spotting actually destroys the majority of structures in a wildfire because of the ember fallout. So even though you have that great defensible space and we have good fire behavior around the property, we still have to protect our properties from embers falling on our property. And that really is because once it falls on our property, it starts to spot, and it starts to spot at the base of the structure or near wood attachments. And then you have torching, and torching is really just a single tree torching. So, if you don't get rid of the ladder fuels, and we'll get more into what that means, but if you don't get rid of the understory fuels, you can get that single tree to torch off. What's happening is all that fire underneath, well, that convective heat is going up, it dries everything out, and then eventually climbs up the tree. Once the tree is readily, dried out now it can ignite. Also, the oil content in trees like these, like your conifer trees, ignite more easily as well. So we'll go into checkpoint one, and this is just a knowledge check. And it's what type of fire behavior is responsible for the destruction of the majority of structures. So the answers are in, and the majority of you got it correctly. It's really spotting. So spotting, as much as the other ones are, the other answers are more dramatic, it's not really what destroys the majority of structures. It's really the spotting potential. So the ember fallout that is falling on the structures is really igniting things around the structure, and that's really spotting. And it spots around the structure, which destroys the majority of the structures. So now we're going to get into critical fire weather. And if you remember the fire behavior triangle, now we're going right into it, fire behavior. Fire behavior, which is the first one, which is weather. So with weather, we're really going to talk about wind. So the power of wind overpowers fire. And why is this so important at the underwriting desk? Is because if we know where the wind is coming from, we know where a fire will likely come from as well. And so the power of wind is going to overpower the fire and push the fire in that direction. The reason why is it bends over that flame length. That convective heat is now going sideways, not just straight up, and it pushes it into the next vegetation over, and it starts pushing the fire to where the wind is going. So we'll talk about one of the most destructive winds, and that's really going to be your foehn winds. So your foehn winds is created off high pressure systems, really really a constant thing. It's going to happen again and again and again. So high pressure system that pushes over a mountain range, and then it has these downslope winds that are extremely destructive. When you think of your foehn winds, think of your Santa Ana winds, your Diablo winds. So some of the winds that are responsible for the Woolsey fire or responsible for the Tubbs fire, some of the most destructive winds, but they're predictable. So as these winds get pushed up and over the mountain, they start losing their moisture, which is relative humidity. They start losing the moisture, so they become a dry wind. Not only because they become a dry wind, as it starts going up and over the mountain and starting getting pushed down into the valleys, it starts not only is it now dry, but it now starts heating up and becomes a very hot wind, which loses even more moisture within the wind itself. And then it starts speeding up to upwards of 90 miles an hour, even gusts up to, it says 90, but really I've seen it even up to 100. And that's really the destructive wind. But the best part about these winds is, like I said, they're extremely predictable. So for example, your Santa Ana winds come out of the northeast today, and they are going to continue to come out of the northeast forever, just because of the mountain ranges within that area. So it's a topography driven wind. What does that mean to you as an underwriter? That means that this wind is always coming out of the northeast and always pushing out towards our oceans. Where is the fuel around my property to the northeast? Is that wind going to push a fire into my property, or is it going to push a fire away from my property? So if you have a property and you have vegetation to the northeast, just continuous fuels, And even you have a road there because roads, you have cigarette butts, dragging trailer chains, really anything that can ignite a spark, on these hot, windy days. Is if it ignites there, is it going to immediately push a fire towards my property? Do I need more defensible space clearance in that area? Or is all the vegetation really to the south southwest of my property? And during these hot, windy days, is it going to push a fire away? Now, I'm not saying that the vegetation to the south southwest is means, oh, that's great vegetation. Now we don't have to deal with it. No, you should still have defensible space. But when you're thinking about these large destructive fires, like again, the Woosley fires and the Tubbs fires of the world, you should be looking at, how do we survive one of those? We really start understanding, the flow and winds within the area. So now we're going to go straight into fuels. And what is a fuel? So first off, a fuel, everyone just usually thinks vegetation, but it's not vegetation. It's also the structure itself. So yes, it's the pine needles on the ground. Yes, it's the trees, but it's also the structures. And so when you're looking at defensible space, you need to look at, what is the structure density and what is the vegetation in between it. If you have a great property, but it's only, 10 feet away from a structure that is a terrible property, and you're like, yeah, if I would have insured the structure that's 10 feet away, I would have said no. But since this property is good, I'm going to say yes. That's not really how it works, because if that property were to go, the likelihood of your property going is now that much higher. So understanding that it's a community effort when you're looking at it, not just a single structure effort. And so there's some risk that when you look at them, you have to look at the neighboring properties, because that is also fuel. And you have to think about it as fuel, that if this were to ignite, could this damage my property? And then fuel arrangement matters. And so when you're looking at fuel and you're trying to understand the vegetation around your property, fuel arrangement really matters. So when you're looking at the grass, so you have the horizontal continuity. And what that means is you just have continuous vegetation in the area. So all this dry and dead grass, if I were to light that off, a fire can just ignite and move across the landscape uninterrupted, no fuel breaks, just continue to burn in that area. And so that's just continuous vegetation, continuous horizontal continuity. Then you have vertical arrangement. Remember that crown fire that we just saw? So that crown fire was able to get into the tree canopies because there's continuous vegetation from the ground all the way to the tops of the trees. I'll also point out in that picture that this area looks like it was also a little bit of beetle kill, but also a blowdown. And when you look in between the trees, you see all that dead vegetation. The dead vegetation also matters. So you'll see the spots of dead standing trees and dead, as well as the dead fuel underneath it. What happens is yeah, ember fallout happens in that area, when a fire is approaching it, because ember fallout usually is in front of the fire. And this starts to ignite. The reason why it starts to ignite is because all this dead vegetation. Think about it this way. If you want to go get firewood, are you going to cut down the live tree and chop it up and put it in your fireplace? Of course not. That's not going to burn very well. What will burn is all those dead standing trees, all the dead fuel on the ground. And then just like a structure would ignite, just how a structure would, if there's a bunch of dead stuff around it, it would start baking the walls of the structure and starting to ignite the decks and start getting into the walls or breaking windows. Just how a structure will start to ignite, so will the forest around it. And so if all that dead fuel were to ignite, the live trees would also start to ignite just because they're getting rapidly dried out. And so when we're talking about vertical fuel arrangement, we're talking, so you have really four elements, which is your ground fuels, your surface fuels, your ladder fuels, and your aerial fuels. Your ground fuels is really where you're going to get your ground fuels, and your surface fuels is really where you're going to get that smoldering and creeping fire, but they don't necessarily mean that they're ladder fuels. So ladder fuels, if you can look where that label is going across, you see all that dead limbs that go all the way to the ground. That's a path where a fire can move up to the tops of the canopy. Now, even if it weren't to be a running crown fire like you saw, but this were to ignite that single tree and make a torching, because even torching could be quite devastating to a structure if it happens close enough. Getting that separation between the ladder fuels and the surface fuel and ground fuels are extremely important. And when you're looking at it, once again, think, oh, okay, so if this can burn the height of 3 times the height of the vegetation, what is a separation from the tops of the base of the canopy And what is the separation to the surface fuels and ground fuels? Are the surface fuels and ground fuels low enough to the ground where I limbed up my trees, 6 to 10 feet, where even if a fire were to pass underneath these trees, it's not going to get into the canopies. Or in crown fires are also in bushes. Are we keeping the fuels underneath the bushes low enough where it's just where there's nothing that can ignite underneath a bush, or are we keeping those limbed up, especially your larger bushes? Are we limbing those up a little bit so we can get underneath there and clear out some of that dead vegetation on a continuous basis, so it won't ladder up into the tops of the larger bushes, and it won't ladder up into our crowns. And so what are we talking about when we're talking about, ladder fuels? And this is exactly what we're talking about. So you have all that dead limbs just going all the way to the base, or just limbs in general that goes all the way to the base of these trees, and it gives an avenue where fire can get into those trees. What's happening is that convective heat is just getting pushed up to the top of those trees, to the top of the trees, and it's just rapidly drying it out and just moving to the top. If you were to remove all those limbs and removed all the dead vegetation from underneath that tree, it wouldn't have been able to move up the tree. And that's really what you want to get to when you're looking at defensible space around the properties. Does my insured, do they have trees that go all the way to the ground, or are they nicely limbed up so that when a fire does come through, it doesn't get into the trees? Because if you think about it this way, we're really battling embers and cigarettes. If you think about cigarettes and you throw a cigarette at the tree, is it just going to explode? No, it wouldn't. It's going to ignite the stuff at the base. Well, what's going to happen at the base of the tree? Is it going to be able to get into the tops? And that's what we're trying to prevent. And so again, we're going back to dead fuel. So we're gonna talk about a little bit about live to dead fuel ratio. And the reason why it really matters is because, like I said, that dead fuel is going to be an avenue to start igniting all that live and healthy fuel really easily. And so when we're looking at fuel in general, we're going to be looking at, at the top so all this, and this pertains to dead vegetation. And I want to be clear about this. This pertains to dead vegetation. So if you look at the grass, that grass is about a 0 to 1/4 inch, and that means that it only takes 1 hour to adapt to its environment, because you have size and shape and time lag. What does that mean? That means on a hot day, dead grass takes 1 hour to be ready to ignite. So on a hot day, within 1 hour of that day being hot and dry, that grass is ready to start getting embers to fall into it and start putting on flame. Anything that is a 1/4 inch to 1 inch takes 10 hours. So on the second day, or even somewhere in the first day, that fuel is ready. That fuel is ready to ignite. All your sticks on the ground are ready to start burning. Now, remember, once your sticks start burning and once your grass starts burning, it's going to dry out everything around it as it starts to burn. It's not a high intensity burn, but it does start baking the larger fuels. But if your larger fuels were to be ready to ignite, and that's 1 inch to 3 inches is 100 hours. So what you think about this is after a couple weeks, this is ready to ignite as well. And then you have your 1,000 hours. And so you can't just think about it like, oh, okay, so in the winter time, this stuff isn't ready to burn. No, you have drought plays a factor. Even anything over 8 inches really goes to your 10,000 hours. So think of your dead standing entire trees. Drought really starts to play a factor. But if you look at all this is perfect firewood. This is what you'd go out and grab and start to ignite. You know, it doesn't take very long for anything that's on the ground that's dead, to get to the point where it's ready to adapt to its environment, especially like in California, where it's just a dry atmosphere in general, to be ready to ignite by a fire. So during your Santa Ana wind event days, even if it was a cold night and the relative humidity was somewhat high, 1 hour of that wind blowing, all the grass in that area is ready to ignite. And then as stuff starts to ignite, things dry out very rapidly, and the fire is able to propagate around across the landscape pretty easy. So contact check number 2. As foehn winds such as the Santa Ana winds in California are forced down the leeward side of the mountain, what changes occur? So we're talking about your Santa Ana winds. We're talking about your Diablo winds. And you also have different winds throughout the United States, but really those are the ones that catch most people's attention because they are in California. And I will say, as everybody's answering the question, when you think about your dead grasses, when you think about even the smaller twigs, that's really what's at the base of the structure that kind of grows throughout the year. So on a hot day, those grasses that don't seem very threatening, or even the bark mulch that's at the base of the structure, it really doesn't take very long for that to start getting dried out to where it's ready to ignite and start igniting your structures. So just some food for thought as we're answering the question. Oh, this is great. So So air does speed up, temperature does rise, and relatively, so 68% got it correctly. And this was supposed to be the hard question of the bunch. So that's good. So air speeds up, temperature rises, and relatively humidity decreases, correct. So that's your destructive winds that go really all the bad things that happen, all the bad things happen when the alignment of bad things happen for weather when those winds are happening. So what are the influences on topography? So now we're going to go into fire behavior when it comes to topography. So you have your canyons, your ridges, your chutes and saddles, and your natural and constructive barriers. So for fire behavior, we went through weather, we went through fuels, and now we're talking about the topography itself. So narrow canyons. So first, when you're looking at when you're sitting at your underwriting desk and you say, okay, this is where my property is. It's not just about even though the fuel is what you can manipulate to understand how that fuel is going to react to its environment. You have to understand, what is the weather in that area? What is the seasonality? Is this area impacted by those large winds? And you also have to understand the fuel, but you have to also understand what is the topography. And the reason why the topography is so important is not it will push your winds in certain directions. The reason why is because air cannot move through solid objects. And so as it impacts the sides of the mountain, just like water, it starts flowing more rapidly in the areas where it's getting constricted. And as it starts constricting, it starts pushing up more rapidly. So what that means is in your narrow canyons, areas where the canyons are more narrow, wind's going to impact the sides of the walls, and then start getting restricted into the smaller areas, and then start pushing that way much quicker. And what happens is that that makes more rapid fire behavior within a narrow canyon. Not only is a narrow canyon, not only does wind speed up in narrow canyons, but also fires a lot it's a lot easier for fire to transfer from one side of the slope to the other side of the slope. And that's through spotting as well as rollout. So as fires are burning, stuff will roll down the mountain and then possibly connect the other side. So when you're looking at a narrow canyon, you say, okay, my structure is on this side. Just know that a fire on the other side could likely transfer to your side of the canyon quite easily. You see it a lot in California when you're looking at the mountains. If you kind of scroll through even the Beverly Hills area and just kind of move out towards the Malibu area, you'll start seeing that these narrow canyons are just all over the place. And what those narrow canyons do is it speeds up weather. They're also aligned with your Santa Ana winds event, so they speed up even more within those canyons. So when you're looking at wide and box canyons, they act differently than your narrow canyons. So on the left-hand side, you have your wide canyon. And so in your wide canyon, cross canyon spotting is not usual. So the more wide your canyon is, a fire on one side is not necessarily going to transfer to a fire on another side. Also, there's drastic differences in fire behavior just because of aspect alone, and we'll kind of go into what that means. But just knowing that, a wide canyon, depending on where your structure is, can act very differently if it was on the other side of the canyon. When you're looking at box canyons, and once again, on the right-hand side, think air is going to impact the side of this wall. It's going to all funnel in. It's all going to funnel into that small area. And so what happens is if there's a fire on the outside, so if we were to ignite off these bushes, the fire would race into this box canyon. You see this a lot in ski resorts. The reason why you see so many of these in ski resorts is because they're good when it comes to slopes. So you have a slope on all side, which is, not a dramatic box canyon like we see here, but it's a little a less steep box canyon, but at the same time you have slopes on all sides that the ski resort uses for their ski slopes. But a fire on the outside or at the bottom of that canyon can rapidly spread and move up that canyon. So knowing where to put your defensible space is extremely important when you're looking at topography. Is the bottom of this box canyon, is there just no vegetation? Because remember, if it's void of vegetation, we've now mitigate the risk. Even though winds are going to do what they're going to do, the chances of fire being able to push through that canyon if there's no fuels really goes to none, because you can't have fire without fuel. Then you have your ridges. Ridges are extremely important. So as fire impacts your ridges, so now, when you're thinking about those structures that have those really nice views, are they on the top of the ridge? um, you know, as fire impacts the top of the ridge, it does start to slow, just because after it runs to the top of the ridge, it hits a battling wind on the other side, which starts pushing it over. And so just knowing that ridges in general are where firefighters stop fires, and we use ridges to stop and suppress a fire. There's a reason for that, because it's easier to slow down and stop a fire on a ridge. Depending on your ridge, so on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of a more gentle ridge. That's really not going to, in the absence of wind, you are going to have fire behavior, but it's not going to be as dramatic or fast moving as it would is your knife back ridge on the bottom left. So on the bottom left-hand side, that's a knife back ridge. And what that means is that if there is vegetation, it's physically closer together, as that if you would vegetate that entire slope and you ignite the bottom, it's physically close. The vegetation is physically closer together, because that convective heat is going up and it's going right into the next bush and the next bush and the next bush, all the way to the top. And it's going to be very dramatic, and it's going to move very quickly. So definitely, looking at your ridges and knowing the type of ridges is extremely important. And where your property is on those slopes is also important. Now we're going to talk about saddles and chutes. So saddles and chutes, just like narrow canyons, air does funnel into these areas. And knowing where your properties are on this area. Is your property in a saddle? Is your property in a chute? They teach firefighters to actually be wary when they're walking through chutes, when they're walking through saddles. And the reason why, because wind, when it impacts the side, once again, it funnels into those crevices and pushes rapidly upslope. Also, when you have your drainages, and your drainages are known to, as things die, and imagine a tree falls down, it rolls into those areas and then just has dead fuel within it. But knowing if your structure is located in a saddle or chute, is extremely important, because you may need more defensible space. You may need more defensible space than just 100 feet, because it really is in an area that is going to spread fire rapidly towards that structure. So looking at the topography, looking at where your structure is located within it is important. And I always like to point this out. If where those little greenhouses are, is that an area where it's bad to have a structure? The answer would be no. No, that wouldn't be bad at all, because there's no vegetation underneath it. Even though it's in technically a bad topography area, there's still no vegetation around it. It has great defensible space. A wildfire really wouldn't be able to get to those structures. So really, it does come down to the vegetation that's surrounding it. But knowing if there's vegetation there, that now this isn't just a bad area. This is a bad area for vegetation and for the topography that it's in. So now we're going to talk about natural and constructed barriers. So you have your lakes, which would be like a natural barrier, in your road systems. Even anything man-made is really going to be your constructed barriers. And then also, I always like to point out, your burn scars, which is a natural barrier as well. But and I'm going to answer the question that I always get asked all the time: is, are burn scars good? And the answer is, for a time they are. So I'll take the Tubbs fire for instance. So the Tubbs fire caught everybody off guard, but it shouldn't have, because if you look back, the Hainsley fire, the Hainsley fire actually did just that, and I believe it was the 1960s. And it did it once, so therefore it can do it again. So when you look at, is my property inside a burn scar, just know that it can do it again. And if it has happened all the time, it's likely to happen again. So but it's not going to happen for some time. So the topography as well as the weather systems in that area were the same. The only thing that changed is the fuel. As the fuel gets burned up by those burn scars, or actually by the fire that makes a burn scar, there's no more fuel in the area, which is great defensible space. And without fuel, we really can't have that large wildfire that just happened. And fast forward 20 years, all that fuel is now grown back. And so that's the difference between severity and frequency. So once it happens, and it happens a lot, the frequency of the fire, yeah, that's destructive, but severity is sometimes even more destructive. An area that hasn't burned in a very long time, could is that hasn't burned in 100 years, is really those large damaging fires that happened. Also, something to think about when you're thinking about your burn scars is if it happened once, it could happen again. So we always like to say, it depends on how long you're on the property. If you're a builder's risk insurer and the fire just went through that area, and you're only going to be on that property for a couple of years, well, then that's a great risk to insure. It depends on how they build back their communities as well. Are they doing a better job than they did last time, or are they building it back exactly the way it was? And so when it burns over again, it's going to burn everything down again. These are all the questions that you need to ask yourself at the underwriting desk when you're looking at that property. How long am I going to be on it? How long ago was that burn? And now that I know that it burned, it can definitely do it again. Am I willing to be on this risk? So now we're going to go into topographic characteristics, which is slope aspect as well as position on slope. So slope and rate of spread really go hand in hand. And the reason why is because, like I said, the vegetation is physically closer together when it's on a steeper slope. And so what happens is you get the ignition at the base of the slope, and then you start getting a draft. The reason why you get that draft is because as hot air rises, cold, fresh air comes in to replace that hot air. Well, what ends up happening when that fresh air comes in with a slope, you get preheating, that flame starts to bend over a little bit, and now you have convective heat. Remember, you put your hand over the fireplace. Well, now the vegetation above it on that slope is right above that flame, so that convective heat is getting pushed across the slope. It's rapidly drying out and preheating the fuels in front of it. And then also something to know about slopes is that burning chunks then roll down the slope and do it all over again. So slopes in general, so depending on where your property is on a slope. So now think about it this way: if your property is mid slope, that's probably the worst place for your property, just because of the fact that as it's preheating, as it's moving up slope, it's going to run to the top of the slope. And it's not going to just stop because your property's there. It's going to keep going all the way till it hits the ridge top unless someone stops it, especially on a steeper slope. Also, something to think about is that your decks in general, you like to, we like to put our decks, facing the view. They're not going to put it at the back of the slope. They're going to be putting it, facing the view. And what ends up happening is those decks, the bottom of the baseboards also start to ignite as well. So knowing where your structure is on the slope is extremely important. Now we're going to go into aspect. So you have your north and south aspect. So your north aspect is going to be higher vegetation, more dense vegetation, more defensible space needed. Your south aspect is going to need less clearance, but it's going to be more dry, and that's because of the heating of the sun. As the sun goes across, it starts igniting the hillsides, or starts heating the hillsides. And the areas that get more shade are going to be higher in fuel moisture, like your north aspect. So you're going to have more fuel. So just knowing that north aspect, more moisture, but more clearance. South aspect is drier, faster moving wildfire. And like I said, when it comes to position on slope really matters. Your upper slope is going to be, not as great as the lower slopes, the bottom of slope structures, as long as it has good defensible space. A fire on a non-windy day is going to run away from your structure. Middle slope structures are going to be higher risk, and then you have your upper slopes, which is going to be, fire is going to be going towards that structure, but at the same time, with good defensible space, they can't be protected. So content check number 3. Is an area recently burned by a wildfire considered a natural fuel break? Okay, so the results are in, and it's true. Yes, it is a natural fuel break. When it comes to natural barrier when it comes to fire, just because of the fact that after it does burn, it does stop fire. So yes, it is true. It does slow down the spread as well. Okay, so let's get into wildfire risk mitigation. Now that we know, when it comes to risk selection, all the things that we should be looking at, what should we be looking at when it comes to wildfire mitigation? So I'm an NFPA certified wildfire mitigation specialist. I do like the NFPA standards. They are national standards. Who is the NFPA? The NFPA develops and publishes fire safety and prevention code standards really across the board, used by really all professionals in the fire, well, utilized by a lot of professionals, firefighting, building construction, as well as insurance. We're going to be talking about, some of the defensible space metrics, as well as the structural hardening metrics when it comes to NFPA. So when we're talking about structural hardening, we are talking about the structure itself, not the vegetation, but the structure. Remember, it is a fuel though, so we are manipulating the structure so that it's less combustible, but it is structure hardening. And so we're going to be looking at from the chimney to the eaves, from the tops of the exterior walls to the foundation, and from the foundation to the immediate landscaped area from the structure itself. So what's attached to the structure? What about the roof and everything that's attached to the walls? So from the chimney to the eaves, we want to make sure that the roof is non-combustible Class A material. You'll have your rubber membrane roofs. Your rubber membrane roofs, and I always point these out because that really is the one that gets forgotten. Yes, they could ignite. I've seen it where, palm thatch, that it was ignited, landed on the roof, or leaf litter on the roof, starts igniting and then burns through the rubber membrane. You just want to make sure that it has at least a gypsum board underlayment or a non-combustible underlayment. Doesn't go to straight wood. Because if it does go to straight wood, it can burn right through that wood and get into the attic space. But then you have your wood shake roof. So I will say this, the roof is the most vulnerable part of the structure. Embers are falling down onto a structure. It's going to land on the roof and around the structure. So the roof is the most vulnerable part of the structure itself. So making sure that that's non-combustible. A wood shake roof in this area is just a wood pile on top of your roof. And then also on a house like this, where it's clay barrel tile, you want to make sure that there's bird stops presence. And what that is just a barrier so that that barrel tile, which does have a hole, that there's something filling that gap. So that one bird nest doesn't fill those areas, or birds don't fill those areas with their nests, as well as you don't want embers to be able to get underneath the tiles itself, and then ignite something underneath the tiles. So bird stops are always really good to have due to ember fallout, getting pushed underneath the tiles. Closed and non-combustible eaves. The eaves themselves, so you'll see that there's gaps. You can actually see into the attic space because the rafters are just coming straight out and on the side of the rafter. So when you're looking at even open eaves, you want to make sure that there's no gaps on the side of the rafters that are going to go straight into the attic space. And the best you can have is those closed and non-combustible eaves, like stucco eaves. If you don't have that, just make sure that really look at the wood, make sure that the wood is not, rotten or punky. And that if an ember does get into those rafters, it's not going to start to ignite or be able to pass into the attic space. Non-combustible gutters and gutter guards, really where there's overhanging vegetation. So non-combustible gutters, the plastic gutters, as those start to ignite. So imagine if you have a small little leaf litter within there, the leaves within the gutters themselves, they will start to ignite and then start burning the gutters, and that because they're plastic, and it'll burn at the base of the wall. So they'll fall down after they melt, and they'll start, be flame at the base of the wall now. So it didn't do really good. So, non-combustible gutters, metal or aluminum gutters that is not going to ignite along with the leaves. And then also gutter guards in areas where there is, overhanging vegetation. That is, if the vegetation does drop onto the structure itself, it doesn't fill up the gutters. It has a way of just kind of blowing off the side of the structure. You want to make sure that there's at least 1/8 metal mesh within your vents. That's because anything like a 1/4 inch or even larger or no mesh at all, as those embers impact the vents, the larger that hole is, the larger the ember that can pass through and get into that attic space. Also within the attic space, you want to make sure that if this is a residential home, that they're not storing Christmas or really anything Christmas decorations and boxes inside the attic space. Also, really anything in the attic space. But you want to make sure that the mesh is correct. And the reason why you want it 1/8, like I said, is because anything 1/8 or smaller is the only thing that's going to be able to pass into the attic space. And then you want to make sure that the chimney itself, has a appropriate spark arrestor. As they're burning stuff in their fireplace, you don't want that to then, an ember to come out of there and then ignite something on the property and then, impact the home. From the top of the walls to the foundation, you want to look, especially if the siding itself is combustible. You want to make sure that there's 6 inches of vertical separation of non-combustible material at the base of the walls. As the embers are impacting the sides of the structure itself, they fall at the base of the wall. So are they going to fall at the base of the wall and you have wood plank that is just going to bake? Because even though it's an ember, it still can be conduction. So if that embers are sitting at the base, is it going to fester into in the base of the wall, or do they have at least 6 inches of non-combustible material at the base of the wall? The best, of course, is just having a non-combustible wall in general and non-combustible siding. Also, double pane or tempered glass. Single pane glass easily shatters. Easily shatters with heat. It easily shatters from high winds, that something could be tossed at it. So as soon as that shatters, you have now this large avenue. Usually there's curtains on the inside that can now start igniting. So you don't want embers to start penetrating the structure itself. You want the embers to stay on the outside of the structure. So making sure that, double pane or tempered glass is in place, really helps when it comes to, if this structure is going to take a lot of heat, the windows aren't going to shatter, and now you're going to have holes within the structure where it can go in. From the foundation to the immediate landscaped area, you're looking at what's attached to the structure. Is the attachment to the structures like this, where you have a metal overhang with a chain link fence, or is it wood? And if it is wood, is there if it is wood, for example, that fence was wood, is there a way that we can maybe put about 5 feet of non-combustible fencing between the structure and itself? The reason why is those wood attachments, act like a wick of a wildfire, as a fire ignites it, leading back to the walls of the structure. So we don't want that to ignite and then in turn start bringing down the structure. So making some type of separation is always best practice. If you can't separate it, or if you're looking at a structure that's just impossible to separate it, knowing that, okay, well, what is it made out of? Is it rotten? Is there anything that we can do to the wood attachments to make them, resist ember fallout? And is there anything around it that we can remove so that they don't ignite? So now we're going to go into vegetation management. And so this is really the vegetation that's surrounding the structure itself. And how do we manipulate the vegetation surrounding the property? We're going to look at from the foundation to the immediate landscape, well, from chimney to the eaves, from the foundation to the immediate landscaped area, from the immediate landscaped area to the extent of the structure ignition zone. We're also going to be looking at access. And like I said, you should be looking beyond the structure ignition zone as well for risk selection purposes. But also when it comes to larger parcels, like your commercial properties, You also need to look at, beyond the structure ignition zone, what is within their control? How do we get this to be the best risk possible while keeping the aesthetics? Because defensible space doesn't mean void of vegetation. It just means well-maintained vegetation or picking the appropriate vegetation for the area. So from the chimney to the eaves, you want to make sure that the roof is clear of, debris, when it comes to the gutters as well. So any debris that is on the roof or within the gutters is really going to start igniting during that ember fallout. Remember, if you have great defensible space, that's amazing. But if you still have debris at the base of your walls or on the roof itself, those are still avenues where that can ignite. And even though it's a small flame, it could start igniting your structure. And once that starts to go, it is a fuel itself. It doesn't just go out. It will eventually burn down. Also, when you're looking at chimneys, you want to make sure that the vegetation is at least 10 feet away from the chimney outlet. I've seen it a couple times where the tree actually grows into the spark arrestor of the outlet, and that's probably the worst. But you want to make sure that the vegetation around that chimney, that vegetation is not going to be able to get caught on fire. So at least 10 feet away from all chimneys, there should be, void of vegetation. And then you want to trim the overhanging trees. And the reason why you want to trim the overhanging trees is really so you don't have to do the first bullet, which was remove debris from roof and gutters. You trim the overhanging trees, that really starts, there's less vegetation that is going to die and fall on top of the structure, and litter the structure, because you have your deciduous trees that drop their leaves, during seasonal times, as well as your conifers trees that drop their pines throughout the year. You really don't want that on top of your structure. You don't want that surrounding your structure. So trimming any overhanging trees keeps that from happening. And I'll give you an example. So if you say, hey, I need you to trim the overhanging trees, I need you to trim the overhanging trees. Well, that's the reason why is because you may remove all the debris from your roof today, but next week it could be all back. So that's why trimming overhanging trees is extremely important. From the foundation to the immediate landscaped area, removing combustible debris within the 0 through 5 foot area of the structure is extremely important. Remember, all this light vegetation at the base of the structure, whether it be bark mulch or just grass, that's your 10-hour fuels and your 1-hour fuels that on a hot day it's going to be ready to ignite. And so making sure that you remove combustible debris within the 0 to 5 foot of the structure. We always say when it comes to the 0 through 5 foot area, that should be considered to be physically attached to the structure itself. So any vegetation you see within 0 to 5 foot, would you be happy if that was attached to the structure? Because it is. And so, succulents in that area, is not terrible because that's not really going to ignite. But when you have, bark mulch or just, flammable vegetation in general, that is a little different. Having those juniper trees or even Italian cypress trees, Italian cypresses, they shed their dead material within themselves. So even if you limb them up, as embers start impacting the Italian cypress, they get into that dead material and they ignite and they go off like a straw, pretty much. It's a single tree torching right next to the structure's walls, and obviously impacts the structure quite a bit. So making sure that flammable landscaping and vegetation in general is removed within the 0 to 5 foot of the structure walls. Also, you want to clear combustible material near attachments. So as you see, this is an overhang, and this includes like decks, and sometimes it's hard to get to. So you might want to think about blocking it off when it comes to those wood attachments. But as leaves or you put bark mulch underneath those decks, like I said, when those ignite, even though it's a small flame, it'll start baking the bottom boards of those decks. If this were to ignite, it will start igniting the wood because that's most exposed of that structure there. So what you want to do is make sure that anything near wood attachments has good defensible space. And then from the landscaping to the extent of the structure ignition zone, we're really talking about the 100-foot defensible space area. Now, I will say if this was on a slope, like I said, a structure mid-slope, probably going to have to bring that out to 200 feet at least, just because it depends on the setback. What a setback is how far is it away from the vegetation itself? Um, so when it comes to what are we talking about from landscape to extent of the structure ignition zone? 100 feet, depending on the slope, it might go out to that 200-foot mark. Um, so what are we talking about in that 100-foot area? We want to clear those ladder fields. We want to make sure that we didn't, like in that video, the vegetation is not going to be able to get into the tree canopies, into the tops of large bushes. We want to make sure that it stays on the ground. If it does ignite in that area, and it's a creeping fire or it's a smoldering fire, not being able to get into the canopies of the trees. We want to make sure that the tree canopies spacing is correct as well. So if they do need to space out their trees, in order to, if one were to ignite, you don't have the whole thing igniting. It's just a single tree torching. That is something also to take in consideration, especially at a property that looks like this. Also, your dead standing trees. I don't know. So it's just firewood standing up. So as fire, even creeping fire, impacts the base of the structure, it starts eating away at the bottom of the tree. I fought a lot of fire when it comes to in timber, and it sounds like Godzilla coming to the forest because you just hear these trees falling nonstop. And the reason why they're falling is because it burns the base of these trees out. They're already unstable. If you have a dead tree on the property that ends up getting on fire, it's likely going to fall and impact your structure, especially if it's in striking distance, or impact your access to getting to the property. So it could fall across a road where firefighters can no longer access the property without cutting the trees themselves. And then removing dead palm thatch as well. So as embers impact palm trees, it'll get into the thatch of these palm trees. And what happens is yes, the thatch burns, but the base of the frond burns first, and then you have this sailing palm thatch landing on the property, landing at the base of the structure itself. It doesn't just burn up the tree. What it does is it breaks off and then lands all over the property. Like I said, I saw one with a rubber membrane that just had an entire palm thatch burning through the roof. It went into the attic space because the palm thatch was about that distance away on a Santa Ana wind event day. And then access. So access to the property is extremely important. For multiple things, even during a wildfire event, if there's a small little flame at the property, it gives firefighters the opportunity to be able to put that out. But also access is also important. What if there's a kitchen fire? I mean, even going to that standpoint, where firefighters going to be able to get to the structure in time to save it. So making sure that access is adequate. I will say if the road's overgrown like this one and all this was on fire, firefighters are not fireproof. They're not going to be able to just go through there. What they're going to do is they're going to stand back. They're going to wait for the fire, for everything to get burned up. And once the fire intensity goes lower, where they feel comfortable with driving their vehicle through it, then they will pass. So they'll back off and let the fire do what it's going to do, and then try to save what they can. So this imagination that firefighters are going to get there and put everything out, that just doesn't happen. Firefighters are very good at what they do, but at the same time, their lives are important as well. So they're going to stay back, wait for that fire to pass, and then go in and attack the fire when they can, when it's appropriate to do so. And if the insured doesn't have good access, um, that's what you're going to have to deal with. Now, what you would want is great access where firefighters can get to this property even during a wildfire event and do their job. So, making sure that there's access not only to the roads leading to the property, but to the property itself. And I'll be passing it back to Brian.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. It's funny. I've probably heard parts and pieces of that presentation, several times, but I always learn something new. So really appreciate you, Paul, for taking the time to walk through all of that with this group. Just some key takeaways. I realize we're nearly at time for the session. I think if there's anything that you can take away is one, as Paul was walking through the mitigation side, get up close to the risk, around the structure, within the structure ignition zone, whether it's structural hardening or vegetation management, there are clearly opportunities, to improve the outcome for a given structure relative to wildfire risk. And at the end of the day, the property owner is part of the solution here. Insurance clearly isn't the only piece of this, and that mitigation, especially with wildfire, has a real opportunity to have an impact and improve the relative riskiness for a given structure. And that as part of this evaluation, there are many, many tools that can be used. It's not just a score that we should be looking at, whether it's imagery or propagation models to understand the types of fire in the area that might impact the property. That all matters as we're evaluating the underlying risk. So thank you, Paul, and thank you, Gary. And thank you, everyone. Again, it's 11:45 Eastern. You've been on for 75 minutes. I've been paying attention to the attendee list. I know a few folks have dropped off already. But yeah, we do have some time if we want for Q&A. If folks want to hang on, you'll see there are 2 QR codes here, and I recommend if people are interested in learning more about Green Shield, not just our expertise as highlighted by Paul and Gary especially, but also some of the ways we're trying to bring value to our industry in evaluating and helping mitigate this challenging peril. Please check out our website. If you want to reach out to us, you can use that. Contact us. You'll get introduced directly to Gary Raphael, so they'll connect you directly with Gary, and we can certainly have follow-up conversations. If there are any other questions that you have and want to just meet with us separately, we are happy to do that. So with that, I'm just looking at the Q&A here. Looks like there are a few questions that came in here just at the closing part of the hour or so. So I'm kind of reading this on the fly. So thank you, John, for submitting this. The question was, can you speak to the efficacy of individual homeowner mitigation efforts, hardening defensible space versus community level policies like NFPA Firewise or the IBHS Wildfire Prepared? Is there a material vulnerability decrease if an individual and community mitigation practices are combined? So Paul, it might be a good one for you if that's right. If you could take that, get started. Thank you,
Yeah,
John, for your question.
yeah, definitely. So the answer to your question is yes. Combined is going to be the best solution. So if the community itself is mitigating the risk, now you're mitigating the risk throughout the entire community. And if the individual is also mitigating their risk, now it's the perfect setup to have, just a great risk community and a great risk in general. When it comes to policies like NFPA, Firewise, IBHS, really that's good mitigation standards, that's good mitigation practices that the individual can do, and that will protect their home if it's within their control. Sadly, sometimes you need to depend on the community or the neighboring property in order to also do those hardening defensible space standards. So yes, combined is always better, but sometimes you do get that risk where they have enough property, especially in the commercial side of the world, where they have enough property to mitigate their entire risk and make their risk an acceptable one and a good one, because it's all within their control. But yes, as the density of homes get tighter in those more rural areas, it does start becoming a community effort.
Great. Thank you, Paul. And we have another John, a different John, with a separate question. I think that's good for you, Paul. With respect to fire spread, in your opinion, which is worse, a dense kind of horizontal continuity or a more widely spread vertical arrangement?
Depends on the vegetation. So I would say, for example, if you have horizontal continuity of light fuels like grass, it's going to be less intense. It's going to go up as fast as it's going to go out. It's going to happen very quickly because it doesn't take much to burn up grass. It's just going to burn and then it's out, and you can literally walk right over the burned area within a couple of minutes after it's done burning. That's how less intense it is. But if you have horizontal continuity with dense vegetation, that's going to be pretty bad. I would say that horizontal continuity probably takes the ticket as long as that vertical continuity is not next to the structure, because that's really what's going to keep a wildfire, give the wildfire the ability to grow large. So if you have continuous horizontal continuity, a wildfire can grow extremely large. If you have vertical continuity, it can get into the canopies. But when you have both of them combined, that's when you get those crown fires, is you have that continuous vegetation. It's not just a single tree igniting. Now you have both of them combined, and that's when you have those really destructive fires that we've been seeing.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. And this is another question from John. this is an interesting one. I haven't heard this question before. I think you'll like it, Paul. John, he said he recently learned about a service that carriers are offering. I know we're familiar with this one too, that is part of the homeowner's policy in California, you know, where there will be an emergency response team that will actually go out to the property when a fire is incoming. In your experience as a firefighter, have you seen this as being a hindrance, right, to what your job has been? Do those sort of private, firefighting efforts for a given property, we'll call it, get in the way of the broader efforts to suppress or support the fire mitigation activity?
Yeah, so two things. So the first one is firefighters that are actively suppressing the fire are worried about the fire. The private firefighters are worried about the insured structure. So you have two different objectives. When I was, in the federal service with the United States Forest Service, my job was to stop the fire from getting bigger. I was doing large scale operations to stop a fire from happening. I wasn't worried about one single structure. I was worried about all of them. And whichever ones would be impacted first, that's what I was worried about the most. When it comes to suppressing the wildfire in general, that's also what I was worried about. When it comes to the private firefighters, they're really kind of going in and targeting one structure. From what I've seen so far, they really don't get in the way. They're just kind of going straight to their structure as long as they know what they're doing. So as long as they're qualified, they've been through the same training, they have been to a wildfire before, they know how to talk on the radio, they went to the incident commander and checked into the fire. So they are following everything, meaning they went to the incident commander when they showed up, they checked into the fire. As they're moving around in divisions, which would be the geographical landscape, they are checking in with the division and saying, hey, I am now on your division. They're operating like a firefighter, and then they're also going to the insured's home. Now, is it going to be a hindrance that someone is putting water on a fire that I am not? No, that's not going to happen. They just have a different role. And what their role is to target one structure, which is, that's one less structure that the fire service has to worry about. So that's the way I view it personally. As long as they're not igniting new fires, trying to do backburns, that's when you really start to get into these areas where, yeah, they are a hindrance because they don't know what they're doing. So it definitely depends on the individual showing up.
Really interesting, Paul. Thanks so much. I think maybe I'll ask one more question for you to close out on, and then we'll wrap up the session. Just as kind of a last thing to speak on, can you share some best practices for integrating wildfire risk mitigation strategies into insurance underwriting processes?
Yeah, definitely. So when it comes to pre-bind, when you're looking at a risk, you should do a good evaluation beyond just a questionnaire. So, definitely getting up close, especially if you're writing in a wildfire prone area. So, yes, you should have your questionnaire, get through the first step, but also understanding the risk itself, kind of getting eyes on the risk, if you will, if you have the opportunity to. But also when it comes to wildfire mitigation in general, a lot of those can be adopted into guidelines. So a lot of those can be adopted into guidelines, making sure that, there's certain things in place. During renewal, I know that that's usually when the loss control inspectors go out to these properties and make sure that these things are getting done. So making sure that they did get completed and that you're making recommendations that make sense. And so what that means is if you tell them, oh, I need you to remove the leaves off your roof, off your gutters, was that really the problem, or is it the overhanging tree that is just dumping leaves on the roof or gutters? Does it make sense what you're doing, or is it going to happen again? Are you putting a band-aid, or are you truly putting a fix? And so when you're looking at the guidelines and you're going through and saying, okay, what are we going to pull? What are we going to adopt for our insureds? Just make sure that these are permanent fixes, that this is going to make a difference, and it's not just telling the insured to do something that is just checking a box, because it's not about checking the box, it's about actually protecting the risk.
Thanks so much, Paul. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's Gary. I was just going to say that just to add a fine point to that, I do think there is a There is one of the things that, again, that I alluded to earlier is the prescriptive nature of how we look at mitigation. And I do think a certain amount of tailoring and customization is incredibly valuable, especially in these larger commercial applications and even some of the higher end residential applications. Customizing it and understanding the pragmatic dynamics of mitigation and which mitigation efforts will have the greatest level of impact and improve resiliency and survivability, all of that matters. So all of that has to be feathered into the process of how you look at mitigation.